We'll be looking at Thomas Merton's whole notion of self-discovery. Incidentally, I will be lecturing on Merton tomorrow night also in Sylvania. Merton seems to be in than I've given before, but it looks to me like there's no way to keep from repeating material. It seems impossible because the themes remain the same and there isn't that much new material coming out. I mean, there's a lot of new material of Merton's coming out, but nothing that's strikingly different from what he has said before. I have tried to get in touch with some of the books that have come out in the last year or so and hope to draw on some of those, especially Ann Carr's book on Merton, Search for Spirit and Wisdom, which I will be mentioning later on. Thinking 1968, and here it's December 10th coming up, and we think back 20 years ago. Some of us in the room can think back that far, others for its history. What a year that was. We lost Bobby Kennedy that year, and Martin Luther King, and Thomas Merton as well. It's also the year that the great Protestant theologian Karl Barth died. And we had all the other tragedies and difficulties, like the difficulty in Chicago with the Democratic National Convention. It was the year of My Lai. It was the time of the Russian invasion of Czechoslovakia. So that whole traumatic year, and it comes near the end, and we have this spiritual figure, this person who was trying to, in a sense, hold it together or whatever, and he dies tragically in Bangkok, Thailand. So it is a way, as I say, to honor his memory now as we move into this year. The people who have heard me lecture on Merton before, I'm hoping that there will be something new here, and if not, it's material maybe that you can hear in a new way and process in your own way. I'm going to be dealing with the whole general area of self-discovery. That was crucial to Merton. The idea that much of what he thought about his own life, he was in the process of discovering who he was, getting beyond his false self to his true self, as he said. And he thought, for example, that was the great job of the university, not just to impart knowledge, but to help people, students assembled there, faculty as well, to achieve a greater self-knowledge. So that self-discovery became sort of the overall meaning of university life. As I go through this, as always, as people have heard me talk, you know that my interest is in our current experience. I draw on the classic authors to retrieve their thoughts. My idea is a positive retrieval of the thought of the great people, which means trying to look for what they had to say that can help us today, to try to find the insights that they were able to come to that we can use to make sense out of our current experience, to reflect on life as we know it. So for me, it's not just an historical study or biographical study, but it's a retrieval, positive one, to see what is good in their thought that we might use in making sense out of our own life. Now, in that self-discovery, I want to deal really with three different catalysts for self-discovery. The first one tonight, that is prayer. And then next week, I want to talk about our personal relationships and how those can aid us in the self-discovery. And then finally, the turn to the East. Only Merton was involved in what can we learn from Eastern religions about this process of getting to know ourselves better. Interesting, just in the last couple of days, I listened to a tape by Merton. It's really, I've seen videos of him, and especially that last talk he gave in Bangkok, Thailand, before he died, but I never really heard him in a teaching situation before, and it was marvelous. He was lecturing on Faulkner's short novel, The Bear, and interacting with his students, and they were questioning him, and, I saw Merton just yesterday, or whenever I heard that tape, in a new light. And maybe some of that will come across as I'm able to talk about it. And I'm very interested. I noticed Creedence Cassettes have a new set of 29 of Merton's tapes, those lectures he gave to the novices down in Gethsemane. People might be interested in that as well. Well, that's all by way of background. I thought of one other business thing that I noticed a lot of people having trouble finding a place to park. I know as I walked by the parking garage down here, there were a lot of spots there, and it really isn't bad to park on the first floor and walk rather easily down to here. All right. I want to begin with one of what I consider to be a great difficulty in the whole business of self-discovery, and Merton was very much in tune with this, and that is the problem of self-deception. A lot of times we call it these days rationalization, the inability to get in touch with who we truly are. And there can be a lot of reasons that would keep us from making the effort to know ourselves more truly. We might be worried about what we find out. We might have sort of an abiding sense of unworthiness there that we don't really want to get in touch with because we might be unhappy if we ever find out who we really are. And so, in other words, it's a way of avoiding the pain of self-discovery and keeping our weaknesses at bay in a way. A lot of times, maybe we just sort of develop in life habitual strategies for avoiding it. I've noticed that in dealing with people over the years. Very often, early in life, there can be certain blockages that occur, certain unwillingness to look at who we are, and we sort of carry those with us. They are unexamined. So some people are, for example, there's certain parts of their emotional life that are too negative and too worrisome early in life, and it seems like a blocking mechanism is put in place, and I'm just simply not going to look at it, and from then on I don't. One sort of puts a lot of energy from then on into keeping those negative feelings at bay. Now, let's look at it a little more closely how some of all of this can go on and what might go wrong in this process of self-discovery and how deception comes in. One of the problems is identifying ourselves with our role in life. If we begin simply to think that we are whatever it is we do, then we miss part of what we really are. You know, I think of women who have been mothers and whose whole life is constituted by motherhood as they move through menopause, often have a terrible time of knowing who they are in any larger sense. I mean, what are they now that they no longer can bear children? What sort of identity do they have? You know, people like me, priests, are very much into this. I mean, we play a role. We have a public role. And very often in our Catholic community, people want to put priests like myself sort of on a pedestal and put us in a box and say, this is how you're supposed to dress, or this is how you're supposed to act. And so we have a certain difficulty in relating to people as persons, as whoever it is we are. So to identify with the role is a difficulty. I was thinking, you know, I used to write for the National Catholic Reporter. That's in the past tense. I no longer write for them. You know, and I'd go around the country giving lectures. People would say, oh, yeah, I recognize your picture. I know you from the NCR and so on. Now, when I go around the country giving lectures, I'm no longer that person writing an NCR. Well, I become more anonymous in a sense, and the memory fades. And you begin to, well, what does that mean about me now? I mean, who am I anymore in the face of this kind of situation? So as I suggest, first thing we should look at is how much do we get identified with our role in life, our function, and then what does that keep us from knowing about ourselves? How does it contribute to self-deception? Second element that I would bring to bear on this is the problem of getting lost in the illusions of the corporate world. Now, I mean, I suppose we could say the same thing for university world or other worlds we live in. I happen to pick on the corporate world here because it's easier to get at, I suppose. But within the corporate world, one is expected to act in a certain way. One is supposed to have one's nose at the grindstone while on the job. One is supposed to be ready to move to Brazil if that's what they want you to do. And if you're going to continue to move up the ladder, you move wherever they want you to. And you sort of become a company person if you're going to continue to advance. I mean, all of that is well known. I have many friends who have been through that, sort of describe it in terrible and graphic detail to me. But that you have to sort of play that whole game. And of course that sets up an illusion about who we are and where we fit, or people who are into all of that. There's a falsity, as Merton says, that comes with that kind of situation. You simply become the person then who is at the beck and call of the corporate structures. And one can easily then take on that role. I'm the troubleshooter who they send here or there, and then, but what else am I? What does that block me from knowing about myself? Third, and obvious catalyst for this is to succumb to peer pressure, to act like the crowd. The 19th century existentialist philosopher began the whole idea of dealing with the herd instinct, being part of the herd. Or as Martin Heidegger in the 20th century talked about the same thing, of just being identified with they, where they say. And so therefore the danger is that one moves into simply responding to peer pressure. One lives like everyone else. One dresses like everyone else, uses the same language, says the same sort of jokes at parties and so on. I suppose the dominant way we see that today is with the drug culture and the tremendous pressure that young people feel in trying to deal with that, of saying, one must go along with this if one is going to be acceptable. One has to be part of this drug culture. Terrible pressures that people feel. But I mean, all of us can identify with that. I often think even the people who think they're nonconformists very often, I remember how alike the Flower Children were of the 60s. Very strange, and how it's so easy to get caught up in that. One of the things to notice about this whole analysis, and that Merton is so good at it, is the way we get co-opted without knowing it. How easy it is to become part of this illusory world, to lose one's true self, and never be aware of it. In fact, it very often takes the prophets in our midst, people like Merton who have stepped back and lived in another way, to point out to us the ways we are getting caught up in something that destroys the possibility of our true self. Next catalyst, as I see it, would be the media and the way the media can program our whole attention span. I was thinking that how today, it is said that if you're going to talk to a group like this, you can only give them about 12 or 15-minute segments at most. That we're getting a whole generation of people whose attention span is getting more and more reduced. Well, why is that? Well, in part at least because of television, because television gives us a commercial every so often. So it begins to program the way we respond to life, even our ability to have an attention span that is more reasonable or more functional. It begins to restrict all of that for us. In so many ways, the media treats us just as consumers and deals with us with a childish mentality. What does it mean to be bombarded that way all the time? Let's look at the political campaign in that light. I mean, how many people are subliminally affected by the ads? How effective was the ad with Willie Horton in relationship to Dukakis? How much subliminal message was going on? Especially when we were dealing with a black man who rapes a white woman. I mean, all of the terrible stereotypes that we have in our culture just sort of there, and one wonders, what does that do? What does that do to anyone's psyche? What did that do to the whole idea that Dukakis was soft on crime and so on? So I think, again, you have to look and see what power the media has to keep us in this world of illusion. Next, the problem of looking for security by pleasing others. So it's possible to walk through life with our antennae out all the time and just trying to say, what do other people expect of me? What do they want of me? What am I supposed to say in this conversation? How am I supposed to act in this social situation? Not in touch with what I really feel or what I really want or how I'd like to act, but simply always reacting. Because I need to please others, to gain others' approval, so that will become the basis of my security. Again, Merton has very deep analyses of security and what a great role it plays in the way we function in the world. And what, is he wants to suggest to us, we have to find a way of being secure without just being pleasers in the social sense. Otherwise, you can never find your true self. Otherwise, one is always dealing with a facade or a persona that one is wearing. Sometimes the false self is programmed by religious institutions. So the religious institution tells us how we're supposed to act, how we're supposed to pray, what we're supposed to believe, how often we're supposed to do particular religious exercises and so on. And by setting that, programming it, making it so clear and definite, very often people have trouble discovering their own rhythms, their own approaches to it, their own sense of how often would I pray, how often would I go to confession if I did it on my time, how often would I attend Mass if I did it when I was ready to do it or properly disposed to do it or in need of doing it. So sometimes the religious programming can keep us from knowing our own rhythms. Prayer itself, apart from the religious programming, prayer itself can become part of the problem in Merton's mind. Prayer especially that is routine and formal, and prayer that goes to God looking for approval of however it is that we're acting. Well, that becomes another part of the problem. So one goes to prayer and expects God to say, well, live in this way. It's okay what you're doing here. So that becomes justification for living with the false self, not being in touch with the true self. Merton's often harsh on psychotherapy. He feels that a lot of psychotherapy is just helping people to adjust to a society that has its own inconsistencies and destructive tendencies. So we live in a society that is acquisitive. It has a consumerist mentality in which the competitive spirit reigns supreme. So Merton says any kind of therapy that simply helps you to adjust to that world, helps you go around and living easily in that kind of world, is simply reinforcing the false self. Keeps us from getting in touch with that, who it is that we really are. So, those are some of the catalysts, it would seem to me, some of the things that could keep us from getting in touch with our inner self and being so centered on what Merton calls the empirical or outer self. When this happens, of course, Merton thinks we are less effective people. We can't relate to God as well, can't relate to other human beings, never really tap our potential the way we should. We live, as Heidegger said, as inauthentic people. We lack resolution. We lack determination. We lack some sort of singleness of purpose that can enable us to make our mark or to achieve something worthwhile in life. Self-deception in Merton's mind is one of the great banes of the 20th century. It's one of the things that keeps us from praying well and indicates our need to become better prayers. Well, as I said before, people's attention span is only so long, and so much television does it to us. What I'd like to do at this point is invite you to turn to the person next to you and just to talk for a couple of minutes about the analysis that I've given here, which is based on Merton's ideas, and to see if any of that rings true to you. Any of those catalysts make sense, any part of it that would resonate with your own experience. We're just going to do this for a couple of minutes. Okay, I want to turn to Merton more directly now and say a few things about his life. Now, my plan is to, in each of the three sessions, is to take up an aspect of Merton's life or a slant on it that plays into the problem and difficulty that we're dealing with. So I want to sort of talk now about Merton the prayer and see in what ways that we can look at his life. But I suppose I have to fill in a little bit. You have a handout there, and I know there's some typos on there, and I'll just try to fill that whole picture out a little bit of Merton. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it because, as I say, I'm not interested in the biography as such, and I'm interested in what Merton sees about life and how he lived life that can end up helping us. As you know, he was born in France, 1915. Sort of locate him. His father was a New Zealander, an artist type. His mother, incidentally, was from Ohio. And he had one younger brother, 3 years younger. We'll talk a lot about him next week because he's very important in Merton's life. In fact, next week when I talk about the relationships, I'll go into greater detail about his mother and his father and his brother and the other important people in his life. But what occurred is his mother died when he was 6, and his father died when he was 16. And so he had to sort of make it in life on his own. He spent time in England. He went to Cambridge. We call it that other place. And at Cambridge, he didn't study too hard and managed to father an illegitimate child and lived a rather dissolute life. And eventually, the doctor was backing him financially, withdrew that financial help, and Merton had to drop out of Cambridge and came to the United States and enrolled at Columbia, where he went to school. He joined the Communist Party and lived the life of New York, the bar scene and the cultural events and sort of the wild life that New York City would provide. He was extremely immersed in all of that. Came to Columbia when he was 20 years old and began studying there. He took up medieval philosophy. He read some of Jill Stone's writings. And he began, up to that point, I'd say he wasn't much into prayer. You know, it was lead the good life and enjoy it all and drink in all the experience one could. He was bright and talented and ambitious, and it was just one sort of wild round of things, and he was a popular figure on campus and all of that. Sort of neglected his responsibilities for his child and English. And then he began to get more serious about life, and maybe we'll talk a little bit other times about what triggered all of that, but he began taking instructions from a certain Father Moore, and he ended up being baptized and becoming Catholic, entering the Catholic Church. And that was in 1939. And then in 1940 he went to Cuba, and I think part of it was to sort of get immersed in the Catholic culture in Cuba. He was just taken with the whole Catholic world. He couldn't get enough of it. He was drinking it in. It fascinated him. He was, the sacramental life, the liturgy, the medieval philosophers, and all of that marvelous, big, large world and long tradition. He just wanted to get a hold of it. And I think that's part of the reason he went to Cuba. And so he went to Mass one day, and then he went back for a second Mass. He liked it so well. I mean, he was into church, and so he was at the second Mass, and I think they was like having a First Communion at that time. And the little girls were in their white dresses and so on. Some of the details escape me at this moment, but Merton was observing all of this, and while he was observing it, he had what we would call an authentic mystical experience. And I'll just read you some parts of that, of what he went through and what happened. But it was this awareness. It was so intangible, and yet it struck me like a thunderclap. It was a light that was so bright it had no relation to any visible light. And it seemed like a neutralization of every lesser experience. In other words, this was such a tremendous experience. Everything else sort of paled when it was compared with it. And then he says, and yet the thing that struck me most of all was that this light was in a certain sense ordinary. It was a light. And this most of all was what took my breath away, that was offered to all, to everybody. And there was nothing fancy or strange about it. It was the light of faith, deepened and reduced to an extreme and sudden obviousness. The light of faith suddenly just made simple and clear and obvious. He saw it. It was as if I had been suddenly illuminated by being blinded by the manifestation of God's presence. The reason why this light was blinding and neutralizing was that there was and could be simply nothing in it of sense or imagination. And he goes on to describe, he says, if ignored, all sense experience, in order to strike directly at the heart of truth, there was an immediacy about it, a suddenness. But this contact I had with the deity here was not speculative or abstract. It was concrete and experimental and belonged to the order of knowledge, yes, but more still to the order of love. He goes on at the end. He says, this whole thing, this great prayer experience, lasted only a moment, but it left a breathless joy and a clean peace and happiness that stayed for hours, and it was something I have never forgotten. Now, people who know about mystical experience know that that is a classic description. It has a sense of the great unity with God and with the whole of the world. The image of light is one that's often used. There's a sense in which it is ineffable. One can't really describe it. It doesn't last a long time, but it has tremendous long-term effects and consequences. But the essence of it, again, is that one is at peace, that one is connected in, that one senses the undifferentiated unity of everything. One feels at one with the world, at peace with the brothers and sisters, close to God. It all harmonizes. It holds together. Now, statistically, there's a good percentage of people in the room who know what I'm talking about. Andy Greeley suggests that it might be as high as 50%, half of you, who know what I'm talking about. And would say something like, well, I sort of know, I had something like that. I had an experience of feeling that kind of unity and peace in my own life on a particular occasion. There might be a lot more mystics walking around than we think. But now that begins to give us a sense here of what we're talking about, this true self. You know, the true self of knowing oneself in relationship. Knowing that the apparent barriers between myself and others are just that, illusory. That there's some sort of deeper bonding point that we all have. The sense in which that brings a peace and a sense of integrity with it. So, it would be an interesting beginning point here of seeing how this whole thing develops for Merton and the kind of direction we're going in. In other words, whatever he wants us to do with prayer is supposed to sort of move us in that direction. The true self is found in that sense of unity with others, of oneness with the world, a cosmic sense, or as the Easterners like to say, an oceanic sense. In the Eastern literature, it's often like this, like a drop in the ocean. Even St. Teresa of Avila's got that idea. When it's like dropped into the ocean, you become like part of the whole thing. You fit in, feel right, feel like we belong. All of that is part of what it means to be in touch with the true self. You see, because eventually the true self is related to God like that, and the true self is related to all the other true selves around. And the apparent barriers are not the final word. So what does Merton do? Well, taught English for a while at St. Bonaventure College, but he kept feeling this thirst and this drive for something more. What he wanted to do is to give up everything. Give it all up. The wild life of New York, all everything that entailed for him, give it up. I want to give everything, he said. So he kept looking around. How am I going to do that? How do I really empty myself? How do I get rid of this false self? Get rid of these illusions that the culture traps me in. How am I going to do it? And so he eventually decided he would become a monk. He eventually worked his way to Gethsemane down there in Kentucky, into the monastery, and he entered the monastery. When he walked in, I hope I'm going to get this quote right, it always escapes me. He walks in, and Brother Matthew, I think it was, he says, closes the gates behind him, and there I was, enclosed in my freedom. There I was, enclosed in my freedom. Isn't that interesting? The monastery enclosed him in his freedom. Now, when Merton went into that monastery, it was with the whole idea he would empty himself. He would give up everything he loved about life. And one of the things he loved most about life was to write. He was a born writer. In fact, as we'll see as we go along, he wasn't just a born writer, he was a compulsive writer. He had to write to maintain his sanity. Had to write in order to get it all straight, keep it in order. Had to write. But he went in the monastery and says, I give up writing. I'm not going to write anymore. Gives it all up. He goes in there. He's going to be the best monk you can be. He's going to be a perfect monk. Put it all aside. And he gets in there, and he's working at it. Well, they live a tough schedule. He's praying like crazy. Let me just tell you a little bit about the schedule. Up at 2:30 in the morning, start out, say part of the office called matins. Then you get in, after that he gets in an hour of meditation. Then we do some Bible reading, then a little breakfast. Then he reads and studies for 2 hours till sunrise. So by sunrise, he's got a lot of praying in, a lot of Bible reading. Perfect model for us, this whole thing. People can remember my lectures on situational spirituality at this point. That I'm always saying we can't learn about our spiritual life from the monks. It's one of our great problems. I mean, we can't learn how to be spiritual from monks. I've said that for years. Can't do it. It's impossible. And here we are lecturing on Merton and claiming he has something to tell us. This is going to be a tricky lecture. A hard task I've set for myself here. I mean, how could this be? So, this fellow, he's up at sunrise now, and then he does some manual work till 9. Big part of monastic life, work with your hands, out tilling the field and so on. Then he prays some more, says his office. Then he goes into the public prayer, has Mass with the rest of the monks. Now he eats a little very light lunch, and after that he does some light reading. 1 o'clock he gets back to saying his office. Again, official prayer. Now we need a good hour of meditation in here. Trying to get it straight. Then he spends 2 to 4 hours in writing, wrote voraciously. This is later. I'm taking his schedule from later in his life. To give you an idea of how monastic life goes. Then another light meal, then some meditation, and then he retires at 7:30. Get up again the next morning, 2:30, and repeat the routine. So, anyway, a little feel for what it means to be in a monastic setting in terms of trying to pray and all of that. That's the sort of life he set for himself. And he tried to get into all that and give it all up. Well, what Merton found out is that he couldn't do it. He couldn't give it up. And what he couldn't give up was the writing. And so what happened is his superiors, maybe sensing that, maybe having ulterior motives, I don't know, commanded him to write. And so he produced the book, The Seven-Story Mountain, that made him famous. It was selling more books than anything else. It was never on the New York Times bestseller list. They wouldn't list it, but during those months, it was selling more copies than any other books. It made him an instant celebrity. He was known around. He wrote the story of his conversion, of the wild life he had lived, and his turnaround, his baptism, and his coming to the monastery. It is, if you read it now, an arrogant and self-righteous book. Most post-Vatican II people who read that book now have a lot of trouble with it. When it has such a put-down of the secular world, such a poor idea of other religions. It's a very narrow kind of outlook. Merton himself was embarrassed by it later in his life, not happy with it at all. And yet, there's something about it that keeps attracting people. So Merton's got to begin to wrestle with this business. How about his writing in relationship to his praying? How's he going to sort that all out? How's he going to do this, get rid of the false self when he's writing books and becoming famous? He becomes a person, a personality in the culture, and that's the kind of thing he says gets you in trouble. You start playing ball with the culture media and all of that, you're going to lose your true self. You're going to have a facade. You're going to be an image maker instead of a true person. This created a lot of the conflict throughout Merton's whole life, really. I think one can end up saying he never really did resolve it, never really did figure out how all of that went together. And so he was driven always to get away from the busyness. And this great symbol of getting away from the busyness was to get out of the monastery and have his own hermitage. All the time he wanted a hermitage so he could have his own little place where he'd live and wouldn't have to be rubbing elbows with the other monks all the time. Suppose they wouldn't have the noise and the distractions, so now he could really get into prayer. He longed for it. He begged Abbot Fox, a Harvard businessman type, would become a monk and ran the monastery with sort of authoritarian way. And Merton was always interacting with Abbot Fox. Again, more on that next week. But he begs him for it. And finally, I think it was around 1960, Abbot Fox says, okay, you can have your own hermitage. You can go out there and be by yourself. And Merton was like coming home and finally found it. So what does he do? He begins to tell a lot of people where his hermitage is. He even tells them how you can sneak in through the woods and get to it. Before long, he's sort of inundated with people out there. In fact, he tells the story of one night hiding out in the woods while a group of people were in the hermitage waiting for him. He couldn't even get in there. So, interesting paradox. We begin to see something about Merton. He's struggling for prayer time, struggling for solitude, wanting to be alone, and yet there's another side. He's going to write more. He's got all these letters, wrote to 1,800 different people. They'll be taking decades to collect all these letters and publish them. He's got all this interaction. He's talking to the Berrigan brothers and Rosemary Ruther and all the social activists. You know, he's totally involved in all of this while he's trying to get away and pray. Well, even though the sort of script is written big there, surely we got to be able to begin to identify with his problem. Ought to be able to identify with his struggle, which is the struggle to say, in a busy life with all kind of things going on, how is it that we maintain that prayerful spirit? How do we become contemplatives in the world? How do we keep some sort of sense of the true self as we go about our daily business? That's where it starts to become real for us. So Merton is not one that one can follow and imitate in a way. He's not. You can't do that because most of us aren't living in monasteries and having all those hours to pray. But the dynamic seems to me to be the same for people who are serious about the spiritual life. How do we carve out some space to be in touch with God? How do we get enough distance so we can recognize our false self? How do we get close enough to God so we can be in touch with the true self? How do we make progress in the spiritual life in a busy world? So there's the dynamics, it seems to me, that are the same and that we can begin to identify with as we look at Thomas Merton. The story of his life goes on. I mean, there's a lot of details of that. I think maybe I'll save a lot of the relationships that go on. But we know the story has another aspect to it, and that is that Merton always wanted to get out of that monastery. He wanted to travel. He wanted to go out. And so his big desire was to and he did it periodically within the United States, but he wanted to go east and meet the Eastern monks. That'll be what we talk about in the third lecture. Meet the Eastern monks. And so finally he got permission to go there. And after they said, well, you can go for so long, 2 weeks, whatever, he said, I want to go for 3. And if they'd let him go for 3, he wanted to connive. How am I going to get to go for 4? He wanted to travel. He wanted to experience. And so again, we see the tension. Here's a man who wants to be close and quiet in solitude prayer, but he wants to be out traveling and seeing the world and so on. Again, the dynamics appear to me to be somewhat the same. So that's something of the storyline, something of who he is in terms of a prayer. As a young man, he doesn't seem to be into prayer too much or much serious religious things. He has a conversion. He becomes extremely immersed in all of it, has a deep mystical experience at a young age, and then begins to wanted to refine that and deepen it, goes into the monastery, and then has all of this ambivalence. Writing and solitude, traveling and silence. Always the dynamic interplay that makes sort of for him a fruitful tension. At this point I want to ask, go back to that question, well, why this continuing interest in Merton? I mean, why are there 215 people here tonight? And why are all these books being published? Why do people still read Merton? That's an intriguing question. No, and I don't know that there's a simple answer. There's a marvelous book by Anthony Padovano called The Human Journey. And Padovano's thesis is that Merton symbolized the questing spirit of the 20th century. Just as Cardinal Newman symbolized much of what was going on in the 19th century, Merton did the same thing for the 20th century, so that he is in touch with the questions and problems that real people are facing today, people who are serious about life and the spiritual growth and so on. So, we saw one of those tensions. He's dealing with the relationship between activity and solitude or prayer and quiet. He's trying to work out in his own mind the tension between technology and nature. How does it, machines were a problem for Merton. He didn't know how to deal with those. He wanted to be in touch with nature, yet you needed machines. And so he was trying to figure that out. Same kind of problem we face. How do you live a natural way, sort of in touch with one's rhythm in the world of technology? How do we keep from thinking of ourselves on the model of sophisticated computers when the computer means so much? Technology and nature. He dealt with the problem of freedom and authority, something that almost everyone has to wrestle with today. How are we going to be autonomous individuals and yet live in a world where authority is real, where institutions are part of life? How do we put all of that together? And finally, he lived with that tension between the East and the West. How do we, living in the Western culture, reach out to the East and learn something from them without losing our own roots and heritage? So, Padovano's thesis is that Merton is important and he touches chords for people because he's struggling with what you and I are struggling with. In different terms, different language, different setting, but he's with all of that. And what's the marvelous part about it? He does it openly and honestly. He always tried to be true to it. He tried to be in touch with what was going on with him. He wanted to be himself. He tried to discover self in all of this. And he told us about it in volume after volume. He writes about what's going on in here, in his guts, in his heart, in his struggle. And a lot of times when people read that, it resonates. And people read Merton and they say, he knows what I'm going through. He knows what I'm struggling with. He's in touch with the same problems that I know. He's at the depth that I can understand. Not superficial. Can't toss off Merton because he forces us to wrestle with what really matters in life. So I think part of his secret is precisely that. He's honest and open, and he writes about it. And we can read it, and we can look at his life and get some insights and some guidance on how we're going to deal with our own struggles. Now, I want to take a short break at this point.
At this point, turn the tape over and start at side 2.